Somewhere behind rusted wire and silence, thousands of people vanished, and no government ever admitted they existed. Not one ledger, not one file, nothing. Imagine being pulled from your home in the dead of night, marched through fog and fear, and simply erased. No trial, no explanation, no goodbye. For decades, this place carried no name in any official archive, as if the earth itself had swallowed it whole. Survivors, the rare few who lived to speak of it, described something that still makes historians go quiet: starvation used as a weapon, silence enforced with violence, and screams that were never allowed to reach the outside world. Guards moved like ghosts through the fog. Prisoners were forbidden to speak, forbidden to cry, forbidden to even lift their eyes. One wrong glance could cost a life. This was not a myth. This was not folklore whispered around a fire. This was real, buried so deep beneath denial and bureaucracy that history nearly let it disappear forever. Today, we walk through the gates that swallowed the innocent, and we ask the question no one wanted answered. How does a prison camp operate in total silence for years? And how does the entire world forget it ever happened? To understand how a place like this could exist, you have to understand the century that built it. Across the 20th century, in the shadows of war and shifting power, governments constructed facilities meant to hold the undesirable, the accused, the inconvenient. Some were built for prisoners of war, others for political dissidents, some for people whose only crime was being born into the wrong family, the wrong faith, the wrong bloodline. These camps were rarely announced. They were rarely photographed. Officials spoke of them only in code: resettlement, processing, relocation, soft words wrapped around unspeakable purpose. Local villagers nearby learned not to ask questions. Trains arrived at strange hours. Trucks left with fewer passengers than they carried in. Fences rose higher every season, and armed men patrolled with dogs that barked at every sound in the dark. Correspondence in and out was censored, rewritten, or destroyed. Prisoners were stripped of names and given numbers instead. A quiet, deliberate act meant to erase identity itself before the body ever gave out. Families who came searching were often told the same rehearsed lines: transferred, relocated, unavailable for contact, until eventually they stopped coming at all, worn down by silence and fear of drawing attention to themselves. Local officials kept separate books filled with mundane entries about supplies and weather, while the true operations of the camp lived nowhere on paper at all. And then, one detail surfaces in surviving testimony that changes everything you thought you understood. Some prisoners were never meant to be released, punished, or even killed quickly. They were meant to disappear so completely that even death would leave no trace behind, no grave, no marker, no name, for anyone left alive to mourn. This is where the story turns from disturbing to almost impossible to comprehend. Survivor testimonies, gathered decades later in fragments and shaking voices, describe a system built not just to punish the body, but to dismantle the mind. Prisoners were forced into total silence. Speaking above a whisper meant immediate punishment. Meals were withheld unpredictably, not to starve efficiently, but to break the will to resist. Sleep was interrupted at random hours, night after night, until prisoners could no longer separate memory from nightmare. Some survivors recalled being made to stand motionless for hours in freezing air, while guards watched, waiting for anyone who faltered. And here is the detail that redefines everything. Several testimonies describe prisoners being forced to dig their own confinement pits, underground boxes barely large enough to kneel in, sealed for days at a time, with no light and no sound. It wasn't only a prison, it was an experiment in how much a human being could endure before the mind itself surrendered. Documentation of these camps, where it exists at all, is fragmented. Burned records, missing transport logs, officials who recalled nothing when later questioned. Historians piecing together the truth have had to rely almost entirely on survivor memory. because the paper trail was designed, deliberately, to never exist. That is what makes this darker than most dark history. It wasn't hidden by accident. It was hidden on purpose, by people who understood exactly what they were building, and exactly why the world could never be allowed to see it. Even the guards, according to some accounts, were rotated frequently and kept isolated from nearby towns, so that no single person ever held the full picture of what was happening inside those walls. Silence wasn't just imposed on the prisoners, it was engineered into the entire system, layer by layer, so that guilt could always be diffused and denial could always sound almost believable. When testimonies finally surfaced, years, sometimes decades later, the reaction from official channels was almost always the same: deny first, minimize second, bury third. Some perpetrators faced tribunals. Many more simply vanished back into ordinary life, protected by chaos, by missing records, by a world eager to move forward rather than look back. Survivors carried scars no courtroom could ever fully address. Physical, yes, but also the deeper wound of having lived through something the world refused, for years, to believe. Some spent the rest of their lives fighting, simply to have their suffering acknowledged in a single official record. And this is why it still matters today. Because the machinery behind these camps, secrecy, dehumanization, the slow erasure of identity, the manufactured silence of an entire population, has never truly disappeared. It resurfaces in different forms, in different countries, whenever power operates without accountability, and whenever silence is enforced instead of earned. Every hidden camp in history began the same way, with ordinary people deciding it was safer not to ask questions. The lesson isn't only historical, it's a warning about what happens when documentation disappears, when language is softened to hide cruelty, and when survivors are the only proof left that something terrible occurred at all. Justice, in cases like this, rarely arrives complete. Sometimes it arrives only as memory, as the refusal to let the silence win a second time, generations later. Museums, memorials, and oral history archives now exist specifically because survivors and their descendants refuse to let the official silence stand as the final word, a slow, painstaking reclaiming of a truth the record books were never allowed to hold. What history like this teaches us is uncomfortable, but it is simple. Silence is never neutral. It is a tool, and it can be built as deliberately as a wall or a fence. Power does not need to announce its cruelty when it can simply make sure no one is left to describe it. Every forgotten camp, every buried record, every survivor who spent a lifetime unheard, tells us the same thing: that history is not only written by the victors, it is unwritten by them too, one missing file at a time. But memory is stubborn. It survives in whispers, in testimony, in the simple act of one person telling another, "This happened, and I will not let you forget it." So we ask you, if silence is what allowed this to happen once, what does speaking up cost you now? Tell us in the comments what part of this story stayed with you the longest. And if you believe these forgotten stories deserve to be remembered, subscribe, because history's darkest chapters only stay buried if we let them.